Well, everyone, thank you very much for being here. Just wait for you guys to set up. You're all good. Thanks for being here. I wanted today, firstly, to say thank you very much to Steve Osborne. Steve is an incredible servant of the Australian people. He has a long and distinguished career with Air Force, and he's been in charge of Operation Sovereign Borders for the last couple of years. It has been a difficult period at times because, as you know, Operation Sovereign Borders comprises of 16 agencies, and there is a lot of work that goes behind the scenes that the Australian people never see. So intelligence gathering, working with international partners, it is a very significant role, and Steve has done a tremendous job, and he now moves out of that position, and Craig Farini will come in as the General now in charge of Operation Sovereign Borders. Craig similarly has a very distinguished career with the Australian Army and will come in to the role as of Friday of this week, and he will continue the work commenced under General Campbell, but continued under others, including Air Vice Marshal Osborne, and it has been a very successful period, as you know. In Operation Sovereign Borders, since the commencement, we've had 34 returns. We've had a return of over 800 illegal maritime arrivals back to their country of departure or origin. We've had disruption from our international partners of 79 people smuggling ventures, affecting over 2,500 illegal maritime arrivals, with 616 people arrested by regional law enforcement authorities. So Operation Sovereign Borders has been a significant success, and it can continue to be into the future. I'm going to ask Steve to make a few comments, and then Craig, and then we'll be happy to take some questions. Steve.
Thank you, Minister, for your kind words. I will be brief. I really only have three things that I would like to say. The first of that is, as the Minister said, Operation Sovereign Borders' success does not come down to one person. There are a lot of agencies and departments across all of government that make a major contribution to keeping the borders secure and stopping people drowning at sea. But I'd like to give a special thank you and a special acknowledgement to the Joint Agency Task Force, who work immediately for me and will soon work immediately for Craig. I just need to pass my thanks to them for a job well done. Second point I would like to do, of course, is to recognise Craig, General Farini. He's no doubt got a lot of work ahead of him. I've got every confidence in his ability, of course, and I wish him all the best for the future. And last but not least, while I am pleased to say that Operation Sovereign Borders has continued to be successful, it is something that we should not become complacent about. As I've said on a number of times before, the people smuggling threat is suppressed. We certainly could not call it defeated. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much. Craig.
Yeah, thank you, Minister, and good morning. Look, I understand the importance of Operation Sovereign Borders to our national security, so I appreciate the trust and faith that is being shown in me by appointing me as the Commander of the Joint Agency Task Force. It's early days for me, and I'll likely have more to say in due course, but for now I'd like to thank Air Vice Marshal Osborne, Steve, for your leadership and command over the last 2 years, and to make clear my commitment to continuing to deliver the Operation Sovereign Borders mission and continue his good work. And finally, I'd like to emphasise that while we have a new commander, nothing has changed. And to anyone contemplating an illegal maritime entry to Australia, the message is don't. On my watch, you'll be intercepted and returned. So thank you.
Thanks, Craig. All right, do we have any questions for either Steve or Craig? And then once they've answered their questions, I might ask them to step away, and I'll take questions otherwise.
Minister, can I ask you, Air Vice Marshal, there's been a fair bit of analysis from Labor and the coalition of the bill that's to hit the House of Reps next year on medical evacuation. Can you give us your assessment as to whether it does unpick offshore processing or whether it simply bolsters medical services for asylum seekers?
Look, clearly that's going to be a question that I'll have to be cautious in how I choose my words. Because I'm highly aware that it's politically charged at the moment, and the reality is, and I think I read in one of your articles, and it was quite correct, that you can't disassociate government policy from the broader OSB policy. So I will give the answer that I would normally give in this situation and repeat that the events that happen in Australia, whether it's in the media, whether it's on the floor of Parliament, or whether it's in Senate estimates or wherever it is, they are watched very carefully by people overseas, both the people smugglers and the people that might use their services. So we should assume that we are being watched to see what is said, because even if it's not true, even if they've just got that ability to take a particular comment that they can spin as a marketing tool, they will do it. They're criminals. We should expect that to happen.
By what you just say, does that mean when the government says that the opposition is soft on borders and a return to Bill Shorten will see a return to people smugglers, that they will take that message and spin it and sell it also?
I'll just leave it as I said it. You can draw your own conclusions. They watch all events on all sides of politics and outside of politics, even to, and I should add, even the results, for example, of surveys conducted on people's views in Australia.
Are you concerned by budget cutbacks which could lead to reduced patrols?
Look, I saw that report this morning. As the commander of the Joint Agency Task Force, we get to call upon the resources across whole of government. Now, at various times, we'll surge or reduce according to the threat. I mean, we have to be realistic here. It's not as though we've got infinite resources. But the short answer I would give you, what I need to provide an adequate and appropriate defence against the threat, I get. I should also point out that Operation Sovereign Borders is based upon more than on-water response. I've said it a number of times. There's a layered defence. Most of our effort, our preferred effort, is actually to get the ventures and disrupt them offshore before people put their lives at risk by getting on the boats in the first place.
Farini, what's your assessment of what the effect would be of bringing everyone from offshore detention to Australia for medical assessments? And if turnbacks work, why do you need that extra layer of deterrent in detention?
Look, as I said earlier, it's early days for me. I'm in the middle of handover. I am not the commander just yet. I'm still forming my views on a range of matters, but I would re-emphasise what Steve has just said, in that everything that is happening here in Australia is being watched and could be spun, correctly or incorrectly, offshore to market to potential illegal maritime arrivals.
Have you been concerned about budget cuts though coming into the new role, that you want to see as much resources as possible?
I do not have those concerns, based on what I know right now.
Well, because there's no budget cut, that's why. So there's no budget cut. So I'm happy to answer the question in a minute, but to make sure that the question is based correctly, there is no budget cut.
So then why are some...
Well, I'll come back to questions in a second, but if you've got questions...
So has there been any, since the expressions of concern in Indonesia about Australia's policy towards Jerusalem and potential move of the embassy?
Well, sorry, have you got any further questions for the two?
Has there been any noticeable change in our allies and regional neighbours' cooperation with your command on these kind of matters due to external political factors?
Look, at my level, nobody has raised concerns. We enjoy good cooperation across our region. Obviously, there's varying levels. You know, some of our relationships are more developed than others. I'm not going to go publicly into what those are, but the short answer is, it's certainly at my level, I've not seen any change.
Mr. Osborne, can I ask, I believe you briefed crossbenchers last week on the Medivac bill. Can you tell us what your message was to those independents? And do you believe that any change that could make it easier for those refugees still on Manus and Nauru to come to Australia, any change to the current border protection policies that the government has, would you see that as a warning sign, something that would signal to people smugglers to start up again?
So I would answer that question, first of all, by stating the obvious, that I recognise that we work in a democracy. I mean, that's what Craig and I wear the uniform to do in the first place, is to protect that. So, of course, there will be public discussion, and we know that that will occur. So that's the first point I would make. The second point, in terms of the message that we provided to the crossbenchers, it was to try to explain the risks that they ran with various options that they might consider. Now, that is not necessarily telling them what to do or saying that this is absolutely bad or this is absolutely right, but rather to try to make them more informed of the broader issues at play. Because Operation Sovereign Borders does not rely, as I said, simply on an on-border response. It is a holistic system, and so we just need to be careful from any side of politics with any changes, because it could be sold as that's the chink in the OSB
There's
armour.
obviously been a lot of talk about whether or not the Minister would be limited in terms of projecting medical evacuations. Would the risks you spoke about be mitigated if that Minister had, even in this new system, still an all-encompassing power of final veto no matter what, for example, on a character test?
Look, it would be just best for me just to stay out of that. It moves into areas of policy and politics. I'm on hiding to nothing there. I've provided advice to people in confidence. I'll just leave it at that.
You on policy, just on the notion of New Zealand taking some refugees. What's your view on whether this would be a pull factor, given the experience under the Howard government is when they had TPVs, they had offshore processing, and they sent hundreds of people to New Zealand. The boats largely stopped. So do you believe the notion that's pushed by government and certain people advising Mr Dutton that if you had the New Zealand option, it would be a pull factor?
Mr Prime, what I'd say about that is we need to be a bit cautious about looking at the lens of the situation we are in today versus what it was some time ago. The people smuggling environment does adapt. We're dealing basically with criminals here, and while they're ill-intentioned, it would be wrong to underestimate them or to think them stupid. So the situation does change, as well as the political environment, if you compare to what's going on today, perhaps to back in that day. So we have to take into account the context in which we're doing this. Now, the only thing that I would say about the New Zealand offer, and that is a decision for government, but I've said this at Senate estimates, that for many of the people that we are talking about, they won't necessarily differentiate between New Zealand and Australia. So both countries in some ways are connected. We both wear the problem, and that's probably the best way I'd describe it.
Going back to the briefing that you gave the crossbench, was that at the government's instigation or their instigation? And did you, given that that was a very hyper situation, feel uncomfortable about the military being drawn into such a hot political war?
So there's two parts to that question. The first part is I'm not sure how the request originated. It comes through the Minister's office because it requires the Minister's approval. So then I turn up and salute and answer the question. In terms of uncomfortable, well, whatever nervousness there is, it's just because it's a difficult issue. But I'm not nervous about providing the facts, what the reality is. I leave the politics and recognise the ultimate decision is up to our politicians. It's not up to me. My job is just to make the politicians aware of what the pluses and minuses are.
Is there any intelligence that the threat of people smugglers has increased as we near an election? Has the threat to Australia increased at all, or is it currently stable on the front?
We're obviously always getting intelligence, and at this stage, what I would say is we don't normally discuss, as usual, the outcomes of what we're seeing in the intelligence at the moment, other than to say, and I would say this, we are seeing what is happening in Australia at the moment being discussed, being commented on.
But we would normally be told if there's an increased threat, so you're saying there's not necessarily an increased threat at the moment?
Well, not that I release stuff when it's operational, well, no, when it's operationally not sensitive, or the pluses and minuses. So I have to balance it. We're playing in a risk assessment game. There are no black and white answers. Sometimes there are no good answers. We have to choose the lesser of evil. So right at this stage, I don't want to give succour to the people smugglers or further add to whatever's going on. We're at that stage. You can read into that. But when it's appropriate, then we might need to review that. And we're constantly reviewing.
Did you give the crossbenchers any briefing on the intelligence, or simply your assessment of the situation?
We provided a certain level. I won't say that we completely opened the books. There are security classification issues, some of it very, very sensitive, but some...
Even for politicians?
Well, even for politicians. You've got to remember, we go through quite a strenuous security vetting process before we get our clearances.
As opposed to politicians?
Well, you can... a boss is probably going to...
Or the journalists, I might say.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do. Sometimes you do.
Yeah. So what I would say to you is we provided some information that is certainly we would not expect to be put out into the public domain to those crossbenchers that wish to hear what we had to say.
You say it's a matter of rolling risk assessments and various things play into it. Is one of those factors into a risk assessment external things like a change in cooperation levels due to a change in where our embassy is in Israel? I mean, is that something you would start to factor in?
There's a number of events. That could be one of them, a potential event. And I've stood up before, and I know it's backfired because I've been misquoted, but events such as the change of the commanders could be an issue. Changes of responsible ministers could be an issue. Discussions in the media, responses from surveys. They look for anything they can that they can spin as a change in the policy.
Minister, can I
Okay,
ask
all
about...
right. Can I just ask the gentleman to maybe exit stage left? And thank you, gentlemen. Andrew.
About this Bahrainian refugee from Melbourne who's been detained in Thailand.
Yeah.
I understand he was subject of an Interpol red notice. What's happened and what will happen?
Well, obviously, I've had conversations with the Foreign Affairs Minister and obviously the Immigration Minister as well has been involved in some of those discussions. So in any of these cases, there's consular support provided, representations made to relevant countries and parties, and that's what's underway at the moment. So it probably doesn't help for me to comment on that publicly beyond that at the moment, but we're providing assistance through the consulate and the ambassador there, and Maurice obviously is dealing with it.
Of a red notice or a red alert, and yet he's a refugee. Can you give us some understanding as to what's gone on?
Well, again, I'm not going to comment in relation to the origin or the process in relation to the red to the red notice being issued and the management of that. How Thailand updates their lists and conducts all of that process is an issue for Thailand, so I don't have any comment to make in relation to that. But what I would say is if somebody has a protection visa or they hold a visa, or even if they're a citizen of a particular country, it doesn't prevent them from being subject to a red notice if there's sufficient evidence for that to be issued, or for a prosecution or an investigation to be underway. So that doesn't preclude somebody from being on an Interpol list of any nature. So that's it's just at that stage at the moment where obviously there's discussions going on between governments, etc. So I'll leave all of that to Foreign Affairs.
On the budget cuts issue, why, if there are no cuts coming forward, why then are patrol boats being directed to reduce their patrol?
Again, a couple of issues. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of, frankly, probably misunderstood because it's just not publicly available about the ways in which the surveillance is operated. So I'm not going into all of that detail, but if you have aerial surveillance of a particular vector, then there is the ability, possibly, depending on, again, all of those factors that the Air Vice Marshal raised before, not to conduct daily passages within that vector. You might take a decision that you want to push into the next area that hasn't got aerial surveillance coverage. So there are many factors that are involved. We've also had surges after the boat arrived in North Queensland, for example. I directed the department to increase our activity, both in terms of aerial surveillance and on-water activity, because I was worried about the messaging that would go out with the 17 people, I think it was at the time, that arrived on that boat. And then there are other factors. I mean, like any department, the Australian Border Force needs to work within their budget. If there's going to be an overspend, they'll look at issues. Now, I'm aware that there was a document circulated within ABF. That's not the government's position, and I've given very specific direction to the Australian Border Force Commissioner that we won't be reducing those patrols at all. And no, the ABF has to operate within its budget. Now, we increase the budget across our agencies each year, as you'd be aware, and you can supplement money through MyEFO, etc. But where you've had a number of surge points during a year, or if they've got vessels with unscheduled maintenance, there's an additional expense. And if they're going to have a cost overrun, they will look at ways in which they can manage that because they've got a budget to work in. Equally, there are times when they can reduce their presence because they've got increased aerial hours. The other aspect to it that you should be aware of is that obviously there are 16 agencies involved in Operation Sovereign Borders. We can rely on international partners, their patrols. We also obviously rely very heavily on defence, as evidenced this morning. They're a very key player in Operation Sovereign Borders, and if a boat is going out or a vessel is going out for unscheduled maintenance, or there are crew issues or whatever it might be, defence will step up. So there are ways in which you can surge through defence or pull back or surge through ABF. So again, I mean, there are lots of conclusions that I think were incorrectly jumped to in terms of that article this morning. So there has been no budget cut. There will be no reduced presence on the water, and we've been very clear about that.
Minister, just on the encryption bills, will you accept all of Labor's amendments to the bills that they propose to put forward next year, and have any notices being issued under the bills?
No, we won't. There was obviously a committee process, and we'll entertain amendments that are consistent with the joint recommendations from that committee in the supplementary advice that they provided. But we're not going beyond that. So Labor can try and water it down through whatever means they like. Mark Dreyfus tried all sorts of games to prevent it from coming on in the Parliament, and ultimately Labor got caught out. So we've been very clear. This is a very important bill, very important law, and the agencies require it because of the threat level. And again, they've been very clear about that. The Commissioner, Australian Federal Police, the Commissioners of the State Police Services, the Director General of ASIO and others have been very clear about the prolific use of encrypted messaging apps by criminal syndicates, including terrorist cells. And that's why the encryption bill was necessary. And I hope that Labor can get over their attempts to block it.
Have any notices been issued though?
Well, that's not something I'd comment on. Yeah.
Minister, has Border Force or any other of the 15 agencies involved in Operation Sovereign Borders expressed a concern that their budget is not enough?
No, and look, again, we increase budgets. We provide significant support through the Australian Defence Force when one of our vessels needs to be, have damage rectified or an upgrade of technology in their surveillance systems, whatever it might be. So all of those operational matters are dealt with by the Commander of JADF, dealt with by the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force, etc. So again, there's this document to which you refer. I think it's the subject of the report today. I think I've dealt with it. That's the reality of it.
Categorically, there won't be any changes.
Can I ask you about Craig Kelly, one of your key backers? What do you make of Barnaby Joyce trying to woo him over to the Nationals, and what does it say about dissent within your party at the moment?
Look, I'm not going to comment on internal party matters other than to say Craig is a valued member of the Liberal Party. I believe he'll stay as the Liberal candidate and will win his seat at the next election. So, look, again, I don't have any comment to make on it.
There was no attempts in the end last week to refer you to the High Court. Do you now consider that an empty threat and you don't believe it will happen in the new year? And will you change the arrangement of your family trust at all before you nominate for the next election?
Well, look, the advice to me, the legal advice from 2 QCs has been very clear. That is that there's not an issue. Now, if there's an issue with receiving a childcare benefit through a parent, then every doctor is in doubt because MBS becomes an issue. Every pharmacist is in doubt because PBS payments. And again, providing on the advice to me, and there are different elements to this, but providing that there's no profit made out of a transaction. When Kirralie takes kids into, as she tells me, with special needs into her centre, they lose money in relation to that arrangement. Okay, they put extra hours on for staff members. They get some assistance, but they work with the family to provide the extra assistance. The advice to me has been very clear. That is, if there's not a profit made out of the transaction, then there is not a Section 44 issue. 2 QCs have provided me with advice, including a recent Solicitor General. There are other, pieces of advice that the Labor Party's conjured up. They haven't received any instructions from me. They haven't looked at the books of my wife's business, and I don't believe that there's any issue there. Now, will the Labor Party continue to play those games? Of course they will. But I think they're a little more circumspect now because clearly it could be the case that they have issues on their own side, and the independents have made clear that their position is that if there is doubt, then it should be spread. I'm the only candidate in relation to this issue that's released all of my legal advice, and I've been very clear. Michelle, I'm very certain of our position. My wife's business interests are her business interests. I've not received $1 of distribution from that trust. I don't have any operational, involvement. I speak to my wife for night time so that I don't listen well enough to, what's happened during her day at work, etc. But I just have nothing to do with it. It's not something that I have portfolio responsibility for. Out of an abundance of caution in any discussion, I've recused myself from that discussion, and the legal advice has been very clear. So as I say, the games can go on, but if there are others who have doubt over their position and they haven't released their legal advice, then maybe that's where the question should be directed.
Just on your concerns to do with medical evacuation.
Yes.
If the current proposal was amended to give the Minister all power, not just the ATO Act, but a complete discretion whenever they wanted, would that alleviate the security concern?
That's a good question, Tom, because that's the situation we have now. So the situation we have now is that we've had over 810, I think the number is, people who have come to Australia predominantly from Nauru, but including from Manus, for medical assistance. I've authorised people to go to Taiwan, to the international hospital there. People that have gone to the international hospital in Port Moresby. Hundreds of millions of dollars that we've spent on providing orthopaedic surgeons, all sorts of medical interventions otherwise, an upgrade of the hospital, the medical centre on Nauru, and people go through those different stages of, depending on the level of acuity of that medical attention, and if it's elevated to the point where they need to come to Australia, then we bring them here. That's exactly what happens now. And I know there's concentration on the people who are on Manus and Nauru at the moment. If a boat arrives today, say 100 people, including 30 kids, all of those people will go to Nauru. Now, that's the policy of the Liberal Party. I understand it's still the policy of the Labor Party as well. Now, this bill would apply to them as well. It's not just those that have been on Manus and Nauru for a period of time. So it can take us many months to establish identity of an individual. So under Labor's proposal, providing 2 doctors that you can shop around for and easily find 2 doctors in Australia that will provide certification that they need to come for an examination to Australia, they could come without us even knowing the identity of that individual. And it's not just about kids, because we're down now to 10 kids, 4 of whom are on their way to the United States soon, I hope. And if you've got a father who's facing criminal charges, or a family that refuses to move, even if there are no medical circumstances with one of the remaining 6, for example, they're very hard cases to manage. But all I'd say is that Labor's bill applies not only to people on Manus and Nauru now, but if 10,000 people arrived, in the first 6 months of a Labor government, those people potentially are all coming to Australia. That absolutely obliterates Operation Sovereign Borders. Let me finish, because this is a very important point. If you wipe out temporary protection visas, which Labor has already announced, and you wipe out offshore processing, which effectively is what they do through this bill, it might be well-intentioned, but that's the outcome. You only are left with turning back boats where it's safe to do so. Now, again, I don't sort of I don't sort of telegraph our punches to our adversaries in the people smuggling world, but we have limited resources covering a very vast area of ocean. And if the Labor Party wants you to believe that, 50 boats turned up this month, we've just turned them all back and they've all returned, it's a complete nonsense. They'll be completely overcome within a matter of days. And if you start bringing hundreds or thousands of people through a reception area, or a transit lounge in Nauru, I promise you they will lose control again. And there are lots of people with goodwill here who want to see kids off. I understand all of that. But their medical bill is a disaster. And it would restart boats, kids would be back in detention, people would be drowning at sea. And I'm sorry to call it out for that, but that is exactly the reality.
Okay, I'll have to check the bill. It's been explained to me previously that it would just apply to that cohort. So would that alleviate the...
Tom, do you think that if there are, 5 boats that turn up in quick succession, all of those people go to Nauru or to Manus, if Labor is to reopen Manus Island Centre, do you think Labor's going to withstand that pressure? I mean, do you think that Tanya Plibersek is going to say it's okay for those kids to stay on Nauru that have just arrived under a Labor government? Of course they're not.
Minister, let me pick you up on what you said before. You said that the government wouldn't necessarily know who was going to be brought back to Australia. My reading of the bill is that's not the case, because the minister would have 24 hours to decide whether to follow that, and that if he or she, the minister refuses the transfer of that person to Australia, it would be sent to a preeminent eminent panel, Chief Medical Officer of the Commonwealth, of the Department, Surgeon General of Border Force, plus other eminent doctors. If they were saying this person needs to be brought back to Australia, you can hardly say that is just letting the system run loose, surely.
But Andrew, again, first point is it takes it away from the Minister of the day, who has all of the information available to him or her, right? So if somebody does have a criminal history, in the case where somebody needs to be assessed, the panel would find it, I think, very difficult to overturn that, because if they're saying that there's some undisclosed condition to even the panel has 24 hours, given, regardless of how eminent they might be, they haven't had X-rays done or CT scans or an independent assessment. They've got 24 hours, or it's deemed to be, an arrival in Australia, and it doesn't take into account any of the character issues that we spoke about. Now, Labor's cobbled together this bill because they don't believe in offshore processing. That's the effect of this bill. It trashes offshore processing. And they want you to believe, and internally I think, whilst some people like Richard Marles and Tony Burke and others who have sort of lived through this experience and seen it know that it's not right, they want to believe that they can just turn back boats and that everything will be okay. It won't be. And these people smugglers, as the Air Vice Marshal pointed out before, have not gone away. They are there. There are tens of thousands of people in different areas that you could look at in Sri Lanka, where there's uncertainty within the domestic setting at the moment. In Indonesia, 14,000 people sitting there. The Rohingya make their way into Indonesia. People coming out of Malaysia, a steel-hold vessel, people marketing New Zealand. There are many elements to it. So this line that, we'll just turn back boats, it doesn't work. It needs to be accompanied with the fact that these people, as the intelligence is saying at the moment, are telling the people smugglers, we're not going to pay you the money because we don't think we can settle in Australia. Not that we're going to be turned back, but that we won't be settled in Australia. And that is the key limb that Labor now attacks. And Mr Shorten is treading a very dangerous path here. And I don't think, frankly, they fully understand the consequences.
Of the 810 people who, under your watch, have been brought to Australia for medical treatment, how many have been returned either to Manus?
Only a very small number of
Well,
people.
how many?
I don't have that number.
It's
but
not many, is
no,
it?
it's not at all. It's people that have volunteered to go back. So.
But isn't this the point? Like, even under your system, 810 people have been brought to Australia, and not many have actually returned.
Well, this is an argument, Andrew, if I might say. I didn't read it in your piece, which was, fairly accurate in its conclusions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a reasonable piece, I might say. Well, he's more polite than I am. So the fact is that, yes, there are injunctions here. As soon as somebody hops off a plane from Nauru or Manus, the lawyers race to court and stop us from sending that person back. Now, we have a number of cases where we can test those. We haven't done that as yet, but I've been clear. Once people have received their medical attention, they can go back. But what you're arguing for really is a continuation of the current policy, because we've been able to reduce down to 10 the number of children on Nauru. I've closed the regional processing centre in Manus. We've got the US deal where 449 people have gone to the United States, and we've got headroom there of another 750 or so. We're doing it quietly in a way that doesn't restart the boats. The problem that Labor's got now is that they have, like Kevin Rudd did, undone key elements to Operation Sovereign Borders, and that will result in the boats restarting. So your argument is right. How has the government done this, as best we can in very difficult circumstances? There are a couple of options for me, in front of me. All these academics, and experts within, social media and whatnot, who say, oh, we'll just bring them all here or just do this or that. Those options aren't available to me. I have to make the best decision available when there are pretty unpalatable decisions in front of me. We've done it in a way where we've not had a drowning at sea in 5 years. We've closed 17 detention centres here, got all the kids out of detention here. We've got down to 10 the number of kids on Nauru. There are, dozens of people who are pulling out of the opportunity to go to the United States of America. If you're a legitimate refugee, I think, like millions before you, you'd be happy to go to the US. So they've pulled out of going to the US now because they believe that if the Labor government is elected, they'll be coming to Australia. So, let's call out the policy. I'll get you some updated figures, but it's a significant number. And it's disturbing because, again, if a boat arrives today, those people aren't going to the US. The US has been very clear.
For other people?
Well, maybe, but again, we're at the lowest numbers we've been on Nauru and Manus ever. Numbers are heading south, but you've got, some people who have got criminal histories or have been accused of sexual assault on Manus Island, for example. I don't want to ever to come to Australia. There are many good people there, but there are many who have either been found not to be refugees or people that have had criminal allegations made against them, or we're holding intelligence in relation to those people. I don't want them to come to Australia. And under Labor, every last one of them will be coming here.
On the encryption bill, the tech industry says the definition of systemic weakness is a nonsense. So are you categorically rejecting all of Labor's amendments, even the ones that are to clarify the operation of the Act rather than water it down?
Well, look, I'm on the side of keeping Australians safe, which is why we've enacted this bill. There are now 95%, 90 or 95%, I think the number is, of criminals who are using encrypted messaging apps. Now, we've asked the industry to work with the law enforcement and intelligence agencies to help uncover encrypted messaging apps sent between terrorists or between pedophiles or between drug dealers, and it's not unreasonable. We've consulted extensively with industry. The Joint Committee had hearings, including with industry players. Some of whom were genuine, others frankly weren't. But nonetheless, we've taken into consideration their concerns, and the bill is in the form that reflects a balance of those concerns and the concerns that our agencies have. And frankly, I'll take the advice of the Director General of ASIO and the Australian Federal Police Commissioner in how we keep Australians safe over the advice of tech companies out of Silicon Valley.
Mr Dutton, just on that, the UK intelligence agencies have released a lot more information about how the way their bill will work, it won't break encryption. In order to sort of allay those concerns, which are not just coming from Silicon Valley, they are coming from Australian industry. Why can't the government do the same to explain to people what they're doing is not as harmful as potentially?
Well, again, just sort of dig a bit deeper on these things. I mean, some of the companies are worried about precedent that's set. They're worried about first mover advantage and what other Five Eyes partners will do to follow that, or what impact it will have on their shareholder value. They're all legitimate commercial concerns for companies. It's unusual that some parts of the media are pushing the commercial interests of some of those publicly listed entities, I might say, become mouthpieces for them. But I have the responsibility, knowing the threat level that we have from terrorist cells who are seeking to do harm here now, from pedophile rings who are using encrypted messaging apps to direct children being sexually abused, being Skyped into their homes here. So I have looked at all of that advice. The government has weighed it all up, and we've put in place what we think is a balanced bill. In relation to other countries, I'm not going to comment about other countries. They can, provide their own running commentary on their own legislation. Our bill, our law, is designed to keep Australians safe. We get the balance right with privacy protections. This is not, as some I see of you have written, as some mass collection of data. It requires a warrant or assistance from the company, and we're targeting terrorists. If you're a terrorist, then you're worried about the encryption bill. If you're a drug dealer importing ice into this country, you're worried about the encryption bill. But if you're a law-abiding citizen, this bill has no application to you at all. And that's the reality. All right?
Are you pursuing any other deals to resettle those still in Nauru and Manus?
Look, constantly. And
do you have any actively?
There are no prospective cases. Let me tell you, you can go to Europe at the moment, and if you can get a deal out of a European nation to take our, people from Australia or from wherever it might be, let me know about it, because we have a people smuggling ambassador. We have a whole effort within Operation Sovereign Borders, within DFAT, within my Department of Home Affairs, where we're constantly, in detailed fashion, talking to third countries. The United States is it. So, Labor can tell you that, Bill Shorten's quite cute with his words about third countries. All he says is, we'll enter into discussions, negotiations. No kidding. We've done that for the last 5 years, and it's not easy. So that's the reality. And if people think that all of a sudden you're going to come up with 5,000 places in, wherever it might be, ask them for the detail, because it's not reality.
Have you got a figure as to how many will be left over at the end of the resettlement proposal? We heard the other day that we seem to have mainly Iranian men who are going to be left behind. I think the figure was around 1,000. What is the hard and fast figure of those who won't be taken to America and those who won't be brought to Australia and who New Zealand doesn't want, that will be left in isolation in offshore? Well,
we've closed the regional processing centre. Nobody is in an immigration detention centre, right? If having said that, it's a sovereign right of PNG or Nauru, for that matter, to take people as we would, or as any other country would, that's been found not to be a refugee, and hold them in immigration detention until they're deported. That's how we would operate. If we have somebody who commits an offence today or turns up on a plane without proper documentation or false passport, they're taken into immigration detention until they can be repatriated back. Well, no, we don't, because people have offers of assistance to return back to their country of origin. Some will take that, but they won't take it if they think they're coming to Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane. And they won't take it even to the United States if they think they're coming to Australia. So again, Labor has unravelled a lot of good work that the government's undertaken over the course of the last couple of years. But there will be circumstances where you've got family members, because under Labor's medical bill, it's not just the male Iranian adult, as you say, that might be found to be in need of medical assessment. It could be the broader family members who are eligible to come under the same decision as well. That's not properly defined, and as you know, in many cultures you can define family in different ways. So you bring maybe 6 or 8 people instead of just one needing medical attention under Labor's model. That's the reality of what they're proposing now. But if you've got somebody within that 6 or 8, or the primary person who has serious criminal history, or is, alleged to have raped somebody in PNG or Nauru, Do you want me to bring that person to Australia? I mean, would people want that person to come to Australia? Under Labor's model, that person does, because they'll need to come for medical assessment, or they'll need to come for, some, medical condition. Otherwise, what if they're diagnosed with a medical condition that can be treated in Nauru, but they refuse to have the treatment? That's a failing of Labor's bill as well. Under Labor's model, you can refuse to have medical treatment and still come to Australia. So this thing is full of holes, and people need to recognise that. Yes, mate.
Turning to the budget, on Monday I think we'll see the mid-year financial update. Are you saying that we will see, when we look at those line items for sovereign borders, border force and all those related areas, you're saying that we won't see any changes from the previous budget?
As I said, there's been no budget cuts, and you can wait for my EFO for all of that detail. I'm sure the Treasurer and Finance Minister will be gleefully telling you about some of the figures, because we've managed the economy well. So,
Mr. Dutton, just on two broader political issues.
Yes, mate.
How soon can we expect a final decision on the Israeli embassy? And also, how soon can we expect the release of the Ruddock Review into religious freedom?
well, again, they'd be issues for the Prime Minister, and you could ask him those questions. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.